Welcome back, everyone. Did you know that the first time people received the news was back in the Roman Empire? They carved it into stone tablets called Acta and put them up in the public spaces such as the Forum Romanum. These tablets contained information about important events such as births and deaths, marriages, government decrees, and the results of gladiator contests. Around the same time in China, the government sent out messages called debuts to local governors. These messages contained information about important events in the capital city and the other parts of the country. Local governors would then share some of this information with the local people. However, it wasn't until Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press in the 1400s that news really started to spread. Gutenberg's invention of the printing press made it much quicker and cheaper to produce printed materials in a number of ways. First, the printing press allowed for the mass production of type. Before the printing press, the type was carved into wooden blocks, which was a time-consuming and expensive process. Gutenberg's invention of movable type allowed for the creation of individual metal letters that could be reused to print different texts. This made it much faster and easier to produce large quantities of printed materials. Secondly, the printing press allowed for the use of a mechanical press to print text. Before the printing press, text was printed by hand, which was a slow and laborious process. Thirdly, the printing press allowed for the use of ink that was specially designed for printing. Before the printing press, ink was made from pigments that were mixed with oil and water. This type of ink was not durable and could fade easily. All this meant that more people could have access to information such as books, pamphlets, and newspapers. Before the printing press, books were very expensive and only available to a small number of wealthy people. After the printing press, books became much affordable and accessible to a wide range of people. The printing press also played a major role in the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther was able to use the printing press to distribute his ideas and writings to a wide audience, which helped to spread the Protestant Reformation throughout Europe. Printing press or no printing press, governments were still determined to control the information that people received. In Europe, in the 1600s, the people still wrote single-page newsletters called corantos, which reported news on current events from around the world. However, the governments often censored these corantos, removing articles that were critical of the government or its policies. In England, in 1644, a famous poet named John Milton wrote a speech called Areopagita, in which he argued for the freedom of press. Milton argued that people should be able to read and write whatever they want, without government interference. However, Milton's ideas were not widely accepted at the time, and the governments continued to censor newspapers. The first newspaper in English was the Oxford Gazette, which was founded in 1665. The Oxford Gazette was published by the government, and it contained news from the court and other government sources. However, it was not until the 18th century that newspapers began to publish more independent news reporting. The first newspaper in America was Public Occurrences, which was published in Boston in 1690. Public Occurrences was a 4-page newspaper that contained news from Boston and other parts of America. However, the newspaper was censored immediately after it was published, and only one edition was ever printed. So, as you can see, in the early history of journalism, governments were very eager to control the information that people received. They censored newspapers and other publications, and they punished anyone who published information that they did not like. However, despite these efforts, journalists continued to report the news, and the public eventually came to demand the freedom of press. One example of this is the case of Benjamin Franklin. In 1722, at the age of 16, Franklin took over as the editor of the newspaper, the New England Courant, after his brother was jailed for publishing seditious libel. Franklin himself was arrested and charged with the same crime, but he was eventually acquitted. Despite these setbacks, the idea of a free press began to gain traction in the 18th century. In 1784, an Irish politician, Edmund Burke, called the journalists Fourth Estate, meaning that they played an essential role in holding governments accountable. A few years later, the First Amendment to the US Constitution was ratified, which guaranteed freedom of the press. This meant that the government could no longer control what journalists published. However, even though journalism was no longer controlled by the government, most newspapers in the early 19th century were biased. They only told one side of the story and were read by people who agreed with their point of view. In 1835, a newspaper called the New York Herald was started with the goal of providing unbiased news that everyone could enjoy. This newspaper also tried to be politically independent. In the 1850s, the newspapers began to expand from being local to national publications. This was due to improvement in printing and distribution technology, the invention of the telegraph in the 1830s, and the rotary press in 1840s made it possible to print and distribute newspapers more quickly and efficiently. The expansion of national newspapers had a number of important consequences. It helped to inform people about events happening all over the country and to create a sense of national identity. It also helped promote political and social reforms, as people could reach a wider audience with their reporting on important issues. The national newspapers of the 1850s played an important role in the lead up to the Civil War. They reported on the growing tensions between the North and the South, and they helped to shape public opinion on the issue of slavery. In the early years of the 20th century, a new type of journalism emerged: investigative journalism. This type of journalism involves journalists looking into and writing about powerful people and institutions. One example of investigative journalism is Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle, which exposed the unhealthy practices and poor working conditions in meat packaging factories. Throughout the 20th century, the newspapers continued to be popular, but they also had to compete with other forms of media such as radio and the television. In the 1920s, radio became popular and families could now sit together and listen to the news at the same time. Radio also allowed people to listen to news events live rather than have to wait until the next day to read about them. In the 1950s, television became popular and nearly every family in the US had one. Television allowed people to see and hear news stories as they unfolded. In the 1990s, the internet became popular and online newspapers began to replace print copies. Today, so many of us get our news from Twitter or Facebook. So as you can see, journalism has indeed come a long way over the centuries. It has gone from being controlled by the government to being a free and independent press, and it has adapted to new technologies to continue to provide people with the information that they need.